Hello and welcome back to the Sunday Long Read Podcast. I'm Jacob Feldman. What you're about to hear is a very special edition of the podcast, a first, in fact. This was a live episode recorded in front of an audience of students from the University of Georgia's low residency MFA in narrative nonfiction. I want to thank the program's director, Monimala Basu, for all of her help making this episode happen, the students, who you will hear ask even better questions than me at the end of the episode, and last but not least, of course, our guest, Max Blau, one of our favorite reporters, somebody we're actually honored to have published previously in the Sunday Long Read. He returned to Athens to join us to talk about a story that was very special to him. And now, here's that conversation. I'm thrilled to be joined by Max Blau. Max covers healthcare, the environment, agriculture, and immigration for ProPublica's South Unit. Before ProPublica, he was an independent journalist who published stories in a variety of national publications, including The Atavist, The Atlantic, Time, Stat, as well as the Sunday Long Read. And even more than that, I'm excited, Max, by who else is joining us. So can you share where you are today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. And I am sitting in the UGA's Grady School of Journalism in front of the MFA program that I once studied at. So I'm chatting, I'm sitting in a room with several dozen students of the program, as well as their teachers who were once my teachers.
What's it like to be back?
It feels, even though it's been 7 years, it feels like yesterday. So
Fantastic. And yeah, the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, which I learned recently is the only low residency MFA in narrative nonfiction based in a college of journalism. And so it's a fantastic place to be having this discussion we're going to have now about this intersection of reporting and storytelling. And some of those students, folks will hear from later in this episode, are going to ask questions themselves. But before that, I want to focus on your work at ProPublica. I want to focus on a single piece you wrote there last year. And I want to talk to you about the balance that you've struck and found between storytelling within the context of investigative reporting. It's so fascinating to me. So why don't we start off with what you do at ProPublica? Walk us through how you landed there and what you're responsible for.
Sure. I'm part of ProPublica's 6-person South team. And so I'm responsible for covering a broad range of issues, including health care, public health, and environmental issues across the South. And every now and then, I will cover things beyond the South as well. I came to ProPublica after years of working in a variety of local publications, including Creative Loafing, Atlanta Magazine, CNN, and then going off and spending some time as a freelancer. And as a freelancer, my early days of freelancing coincided with being a student in this program. And then towards the end of that time, I got accepted as a local reporting network reporter at ProPublica. If you're not familiar with that program, the way it works is that you can apply for a 1 year's worth of a salary with an investigative project that can either be a story or a series of stories. And during my years as a freelancer, I had tried pitching that, and 3 times I did not get it. And on the 4th time, I was fortunate enough to get it. And I was there in that program for a year reporting about coal ash that had contaminated water in the community next to at the time, what was the largest coal plant operating in the country. And when that project was wrapping up, the ProPublica was launching its South team, and I applied and was fortunate enough to be chosen to join their team. So that's how I got to ProPublica.
Fantastic. And ProPublica is a unique place in the world of journalism, at least in America. The mission is investigative journalism with moral force. And I'm curious, for you doing work there early and then especially now full-time, how you've come to balance the narrative writing that you do with that investigative mission and drive.
Yeah. There are all different kinds of investigative journalists at ProPublica. There are people who come from TV who publish with Frontline, hour-long series. There are former newspaper reporters whose investigative newsrooms may no longer be there at all, who have come over and brought their talents to ProPublica, which is one of the bright spots in the industry in terms of giving investigative reporters the time and the space to do work that is expensive and time consuming and many people cannot do on their own. For me, ProPublica was a place that, as someone who is obsessed about long form and narrative, but came from a news background, I've sort of been on this journey of trying to find my way away from more kind of A1 style traditional formats to writing stories at the intersection of investigative and narrative work. And that at ProPublica, there were people who I admired, that I was, I remember, I forget which of the years in this program where we read this story. It was, I think it was a former peer of mine, Emma Lacey Bordeaux, who was presenting T. Christian Miller and Ken Armstrong's An Unbelievable Story of Rape, which is, I think when I think of that intersection of investigative journalism and narrative work is like something to aspire to. It is like a masterclass in that kind of intersection of journalism. And so the people like T and Ken, Lizzie Presser, my former colleague Ava Kofman, and a lot of others were doing the kind of work that I wanted to be doing, but as a freelancer didn't always have the resources to do, or would need to go to great lengths to get grants and kind of stitch together enough to do that sort of time-consuming and costly work of pulling records together, traveling to places, and putting all the, some trips are, it's costly and cost prohibitive, I think, for a lot of freelancers to do investigative work. So I went there because I admired a lot of the people who are now my colleagues and wanted to report alongside them and wanted to learn from them.
Do you feel like it is two different skills, the shoe leather, record digging, source finding, investigative reporting, and the more artistic form of narrative storytelling, craft work? Do you view them as separate, or in what ways do you find that they intertwine?
In some ways they're separate. I think in some ways they're very similar. And I think in the kind of, when I say traditional A1 style, it's the what you would expect to read in the daily newspaper, where you have your anecdote and then a big section of findings that are maybe in bullet points, maybe just in a series of a nut graph or a series of nut graphs. And I think to find like the total number of people who died by the hands of a police over a period of time, like you need to, is one set, like kind of getting to that sort of like big picture finding is one skill. I think there's also, like in this story with Ravi, to do that, to tell this story as a narrative required a set of investigative reporting skills that were similar in nature, but I had to, getting the records for like the calls, for instance, at the top of the story, that took a lot of time and a bit of luck to get those. To be able to reconstruct Ravi's, and I know we're going to get to Ravi in a second, but to reconstruct time in a story like that takes a lot of like this. It's similar in the sense you need to be creative of like thinking how you're going to get the records, what questions you're trying to answer, and then executing, like actually getting the data or the documents themselves.
Yeah, let's just jump to it. Walk us through how you found the story of Ravi Coutinho. In late 2023, my editor told me that ProPublica for the upcoming year was going to be putting together a small team of reporters to investigate mental health care in America, which is a massive topic. Mental health and addiction have been topics that I've cared about deeply. I've written about them in my career.
and thought I could bring, value and new insight to the kind of work that ProPublica was doing. Not just because of my past work, but also because of, one of the reasons I care about those topics is because of the way it's impacted my parents, my family, and it's a deep personal connection to me, and among the reasons why I'm a journalist in the first place. So in January of 2024, I was chosen for this project, and our editors took it from this world of, yes, we're going to cover all of mental health, to actually we want to focus on mental health and insurance. And so I never covered insurance before, aside from like Medicaid as a program, but not about like payment denials or things of that nature. So I did a lot of research and was trying to figure out, reading everything, consuming everything from like 60 minutes segments on mental health and insurance to trade publications to see what are some of the new things we could say about the ways that insurance companies are using their practices as a business to stop people from getting the care that they think they should get. Had a lot of conversations with mental health and insurance lawyers, with advocates, with experts over the course of several weeks. And I had a call with an attorney named Brian Hufford, who is one of the co-counsel on a case that has been described as like the Brown Burst Board of mental health care. And it's a case that's been going on. It's sort of like when you are looking for lawyers in this space, he's one of the first people you run into. And for someone who's like a big time lawyer, he spends a lot of his time fielding calls, almost like doesn't have interns or people screening people who need legal representation. He takes those calls himself and he tries to direct people to local attorneys that he knows, or just offering guidance and counsel to people who have had their insurance claims denied for mental health care. And after our conversation was wrapping up, he mentioned that there's one person that he thought we should chat with, and that person was a woman named Barbara Weber, who ended up being Ravi's mom. And so Barbara and I started chatting in February of 2024, and we, by this point, I've chatted with a number of different parents, number of different people who have had their own claims denied, and sort of looking for like the ideal person that can help bring to life a narrative around someone's experience through insurance. And I didn't really know what that looked like, but Barbara is a healthcare advocate in New Mexico. And she started telling me about Ravi's story. And it was not just that she had told me Ravi's story, but she was someone who had written a like 4,300 word timeline and analysis of what had happened and what she felt went wrong. And I felt that was a really good place to start that I can build upon to go find more facts about what happened to Ravi and to ultimately write the story that was published.
And what was that reporting process like? And at what point do you sit down and start outlining, putting sentences together, and ultimately creating a story?
Barbara and I started talking in January of 2024, and the story published right after Labor Day last year. And I am working on other stories in this series with my colleagues. Like we were maybe early on, like 2/3 of my time was on a story 4 of us were collaborating on about why mental health providers leave insurance networks, which was more, we ended up talking to over 500 or hearing from over 500 mental health providers in this story. So we're doing a lot of like conversations that became distilled into like a more traditional format. But in the middle of that, early on, I'm having routine conversations with Barbara. She's introducing me to people that were, involved and had a front row seat to Ravi's experience in the period that the story entails, which is February of 2023 through May of 2023. So early on, we're sort of honing in on like, this is not a story that starts in the beginning of like the opening is not about day one of Ravi's mental health care struggles in 2018, where we're deciding like we want to make this to really be on like a camera on his shoulder to the extent that we can from a certain point in time when he moves to Arizona through the day that he died. There were also conversations early on around like, we all knew that he had died. Do we tell a reader that in the beginning? Like, is that something that is in the first section and then you sort of flash back and walk through everything that happened? Or is that the final note of the story? And I think kind of in those early months, we were debating that and I was really interested in helping someone understand like the very quiet ways an insurance company can stop someone from getting the care that they pay for, that they signed a contract to get, and yet still couldn't ultimately get, even with a healthcare advocate guiding Ravi through the story, through his experience. And so I would say from like May 2023, I'm traveling out to do in-person reporting, going to courts, getting records from Barbara in person, and then staying in the building. Like I got an Airbnb in the building where we're in a similar kind of apartment to where Ravi died, to kind of understand that scene of how he was spending his days, trying to talk to his friends. And then June, July, August, we're drafting. And then I think we're originally going to publish in August, but then we got the recording that is the lead of the story, the set of recordings. We chose one of those for the lead of the story in mid-August, and we kind of restructured the piece at the last minute in order to have it be like more focused on the insurer, right? Because we had this scene that we could really like start at and then walk back through time and move forward.
The thing that I think, stuck with me, and I'm guessing stuck with a lot of people in the room, is the way you are able to include Ravi's voice, personality, sense of character in the story without obviously getting the chance to speak with him. One section that jumped out to me, he wanted to save his business, which sold dream vacations to golfers eager to play the world's legendary courses. He wanted to fall in love again, even have a kid. He couldn't do that when he was drinking a fifth of a gallon of liquor, the equivalent of nearly 17 shots on any given day. And so there, here you have a lot of details about his life that, like you're saying, could be told in a straight news format, but instead you've turned it into a character-driven story. What was that process like for you? And is that something you've had experience you could lean on in the past in terms of recreating to a large degree this character and bringing them to life throughout the story?
When I've recreated in the past, it has often been around like up to dozens of people kind of honing in on like over 10 years ago, I published a story about a songwriter named Jason Molina who struggled with addiction and then ultimately died. And that story was built on, interviews he had done over time, but then like all his different bandmates, people that knew him in different eras, and then records as well. With this one, there were fewer people that knew Ravi, but after getting the timeline of that Barbara had created, which was like more of an impressionistic sketch of Ravi's experience, and also a mother's experience. So she had a clear vantage point that was focused on her encounters with Ravi, and they lived in two different cities, so she wasn't there all the time up close. It was also from a healthcare advocate's perspective. I believe that in writing narrative stories, proximity is power. Like the closer you can get to someone, the better and more visceral or real it's going to be. And one of the ways we were able to do that, this could not have happened without Barbara's help, understanding of what we were trying to do together in writing the story. But she was someone who gave me his and her phone logs. So I had the day-to-day number of calls each were making and the time of how long they spent on the call, which was just like digits. So then I had to go and look up every single person Ravi was calling over a 6-month period to see, was this an Ambetter person? Was this a friend? Was he calling CVS or like some place that didn't really matter to the story? So I spent a lot of time reconstructing his phone log based off of the phone numbers. And then one of the things when I went out in May to Phoenix, one of the breakthroughs was that we were able to get, Barbara was willing to let me have Ravi's access to his phone and to his Facebook page. So I was able to see, and it was not uninhibited access, but it was like I sat with her and we started just searching through terms like alcohol, insurance, drinking, hospital, kind of things that were almost, if you were like sending a records request into a government, you would come up with a set of terms. I was kind of use that framework to convince her and to work with me to like get the texts that were relevant to the story. We were also able to get it was becoming clear that there was like 4 or 5 friends that he was really in touch with in this period based on looking at the phone logs. And so I was able to get the full text from, not just from Ravi's phone, but also before that, I had a sense that was going to be a good space because the friends were also sharing the text with me as well about their attempts to intervene in specific moments. And so one of my editors told me like having access to his phone in this Facebook was like having access to his mind. And while I've never met Ravi, never been able to talk to Ravi, the phone, especially in 2023 through now, like is an extension of that, like, in the way that may have not been the case 20 years ago. So having that allowed us to get, I had a lot, the challenge was not about it was about like, there was so much about his drinking that it was really like, how do we distill, synthesize, and pick the right moments to get to that kind of passage you're talking about? One of the things that was happening with Ravi was that he was not getting care most of the time. He had 4 hospitalizations, and we didn't know if we would be able to get insurance records throughout much of the reporting. So the phone log was, once we had the realization that we could use the phone log to recreate his efforts to get care and to make calls, you can, like, I forget the exact number in the story, but there's one sentence where we describe the hours and the minutes of how many, like it was like 5 hours and 22 minutes that they spent on the phone with the insurer trying to get a single therapist appointment. That is from just telling the number of minutes from all the calls I was able to see in the log and realize this is an Ambetter number, this is an Ambetter number, and then adding those up allowed us to, like, that is a finding, like, to your question earlier about what is the difference between like narrative work and investigative work, like to get that number took probably a couple of days between getting the phone logs, convincing Barbara that I was not going to use those for some ill-intended purpose. And once we're able to add all that up and then reverse engineer the phone log to see who he was calling, that number was one data point that showed us how in a specific moment in the story of how hard it was for him to get care. And then we matched that with kind of all the other similar kinds of findings that we did. So the phone, going back to your question about the phone, like the phone ended up being a proxy set of records for care that was not being received. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as you mentioned, I think it is those numbers that you spent days or weeks or months collecting that ultimately make the story so impactful. And the other element, obviously, you touched on briefly, was the ending and the way you guys decided to end the story. So walk me through, A, how you developed that scene through reporting, and then B, in the editing process, the conversation you were having with editors about the right way to end the story and where in the story to put, that powerful image that you were able to recreate.
Yeah, so I think if you think of the chronology of the story where we had close insight and access to Ravi. It starts somewhere around Thanksgiving of 2023, and it goes through, say, his celebration of life about several weeks after he passed. I've seen stories that end with a celebration of life that kind of ends with a memory or on a note about who Ravi is. But I think in this, and this is because of the way, one of the things that was shocking is that I've never heard of anyone dying by being crushed by a Murphy bed. And that's a really just like, there's lots of, I've covered murders and accidental deaths and non-accidental deaths, but like that was a thing I took a long time to get people to wrap their heads around. And I think if the journey was in the story from him trying to get care and almost killing himself in that first moment, and then doing all these things to stop death from happening again, ending there seemed like a natural place to end the story. Not a natural place, but a fitting place to end a story. I think one of the things we're really concerned about is like, how do you show that in the story without being too lurid? How do you do it without, in a way that's trauma informed, in a way that is, in my head, I like the record is like, I've seen the foot. It is possible to describe it in a very vivid way if one wanted to do a thick description of it. But I felt like Ravi didn't deserve that kind of like lurid treatment. And I felt if the point was to really show how he was, if the story is about the ways that like he was trying the death wasn't the point in the sense of like describing it in a very vivid way, in a way that you might have in a different kind of story with a different kind of death. And I think we also, because of like the unusual nature of how he died, I think we didn't want people kind of dwelling on like, wait, did he like, the point of the end even wasn't that it was a suicide or if it was, like the natural causes, whatever it was, like it was, he didn't get the care he should have gotten. And so by his friend finding him and you just getting that sight of it, that was the way we, I think, ultimately wanted to go with like a less is more approach, but also not shy away from what his friend saw.
Do you have a rule of thumb? Because I think it's so tricky, and I definitely, reading some of my past work, have regrets or would have phrased things differently in terms of you work so hard to get these details, and then you don't want to be salacious. You want to go over the line of sharing more details than are needed to get the point across or are respectful to a person. Like, how do you and maybe as a team with editors like navigate that process?
I think in this story, one of the things that, we had 4 hospitalizations. We had multiple suicide attempts in the story. We had many texts of Ravi describing the extensive nature of his drinking, like, him describing much more than what's in the story. Like that if you were to lay out the whole set of harm in the story, it would be overwhelming and would distract, I think, from the ultimate point of the story, which was that he sought care. He was sick, he sought care, he paid for the care, the access to the care, and the company didn't follow through on what it was supposed to do. And so I think part of it is like, let's use the hospitalizations, for example. If you have records from 4 different hospitalizations, if you use them all as scenes, they're going to dilute the impact of the others. And so it was really a moment of like, what is the most important or the right hospital? Not necessarily the worst one, but like, where does this fit in the sequence of things? And I think, in this story, it was important to do it on Mother's Day because it was where Barbara was there, and it was like one of the limited points where they were with each other in this 3-month period. And it was a unique way to show how she was witnessing this firsthand, like it kind of it matched up with her firsthand observation of the seizure that happened that led to the hospitalization. And like stitching those together created something more powerful than just any one of the hospitalizations records alone offered. I think also, yeah, so I think it's a lot of like considering how much is too much and considering like what is the right use of material that can be similar but so similar that it would kind of like minimize the impact of using it once.
Along those lines, like I want to ask about how you think about suspense. How you think about hope in the story, because there are moments of hope in the course of the story, even though you know the result. And ultimately, like drama. It's when you started talking about this is part of a larger project, an investigation into mental health insurance and the inability to get care for a lot of people. That's not necessarily narrative gold, and so I think what you've done and what's so impressive here is finding the story in there. What is the value of those kinds of more dramatic elements in an investigation?
I think in this story in particular, insurance is something we all have an experience with. We all, most of us in this room have insurance of some kind, and I think one of the things as I was talking to people, not just my editors, but just like friends and family in my life, like I think the idea of a ghost network is something we've all experienced in one way or another. Like we've all had the experience of trying to get a medical provider of any kind and not all of them being available because they surprise don't take your insurance or can't see you for 6 months. So like it's a thing I think we all know well, but it's kind of hidden, a bureaucratic issue and something that a lot of people just accept as the way things are. And so I think in this story, like I had never seen anyone try to like report the experience of a ghost network. And I thought that was really important once I heard Barbara tell me her experience of Ravi's story. It seemed like there was a unique opportunity to show what that experience, like what does it actually mean to have to go through a ghost network and what are the costs of that? And I think in terms of like hope and suspense, like, I think if you just told people Ravi died at the top of the story because he didn't get access to care, you don't really get to understand what that truly means in his experience. Like this is, he's someone who did everything right. And he had someone who knew how to navigate the system. And if someone like Ravi, if you reveal that he's dead in the first section, like I think you lose sight of the fact of how excruciating a ghost network can be for someone. But also if you can, I think by allowing someone to like have this question in her head, like is he going to make it or isn't he going to make it till the very end, it not only gives you someone to like root for or cheer for, because I think like I don't think I think most readers want Ravi to live in that story, and even if you have doubts that he will over time. I think in getting someone to come along for that journey for a 25 or 30 minute read, you then can also slip in the vegetables of the story, the concept about Centene, like the ways that the wonkiness of insurance works. I don't think most people are going to choose to read about that on their own, and I think it was my duty in writing about Ravi to help people understand the system as well as a person in their journey through that story. And so finding the ways to show that as opposed to telling that. And then when you did have to tell some of that, it was in the right moments and people were invested enough to want to read through that material. That's kind of was sort of the challenge in the way that we were wrestling with the material.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, I think what's most impressive and important about the piece is it really becomes a story about the loss of hope, and the thievery of hope, in a sense, the denial of hope. And even if the ending had been different, and in other similar cases, maybe the ending is slightly different for the person at the center. I think the story that you guys are telling is, what's being taken is hope in many of these cases. You mentioned a little bit earlier that there is a personal component to mental health. Are you comfortable speaking more about that and how that played into your coverage here?
Yeah, I grew up in a family that has been, has struggled with alcohol addiction and some drug addiction. For most of my life, my mom and I didn't chat or didn't have a relationship. She was sober from 18 to her mid 30s, and when I was 6, she struggled. She relapsed and ultimately struggled with mental health and addiction illnesses, and ultimately lost custody of me. And it's something that, like, in this program, one of the things I like that's part of my body of work that I wrote. This has not been published, but it's a piece about, it's a story about how addiction pulled us apart and then brought us back together. And so the story kind of looks at that experience, and someday I will hopefully publish that. But I've had that experience, but it's also my aunts and uncles. I've lost a cousin to an opioid overdose. And I think a lot of why I became a healthcare reporter in the first place has to do with, growing up, I was not attuned to, I did not have the education about the science or the risks that came with addiction. My dad explained it to me as a coin toss, and it was as simple as that, which made every experience I had with drinking, raised the stakes tremendously. And so over time, through work that I had written about with that Jason Molina story, some work at CNN, Stat, and as a freelancer, started to dig into understanding the science of addiction, the systems that shape barriers to care, and in some ways, the Ravi story is continuation of that work.
Are those stories that you share with Barbara or with other sources as part of this? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I usually share with people that a version of my family's struggles. I don't want to I want them to know that it's not just another story for me when it's about something that I have a close connection with. It's that it means I have a direct connection to it. I think can help just build trust and in a relationship with the people that I'm reporting about and with. And I say with because, just to reiterate, the story about Ravi cannot happen without Barbara. And in the same way that a lot of the stories that I write about people who are experiencing addiction or, some challenge with getting care, it is not just a reporter going in, extracting facts and leaving, but I still talk with Barbara, and I try to, when I write stories like this, where we're doing something together, the relationship that I have with the people I'm writing about doesn't end when the story publishes.
Given that I think the story ran almost a year ago now, 11 months or so, or maybe more when this runs, tell us about what that year has been like, the impact, the reception to the story, both for you and for Barbara, if you're still talking with her. As I think we mentioned at the beginning, this was part of a series that was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting. It's been read by some very famous actors and a super cool adaptation. What has that been like for you?
So after the story published, we continued to report. I wrote one more story about ghost networks, and then I think the coolest parts about the time since then has been, one, the adaptation you mentioned, which for those of you in the room who might not be familiar with this, there was a theater production company called School of War that started a series where they adapt long-form journalism into a live reading by famous actors. And so in the spring and throughout the late winter, I was working with this company to help adapt this for a reading that, I went up to New York and got to watch Oscar Isaac play Ravi, and and other actors from Queen's Gambit and Law and Order SVU, like put voices behind these people, which was, you know, and Barbara and I got to watch it in a room full of like 150 people who then, like, we all had a conversation about the story, and about everyone's own, what they brought to the table in terms of their addiction or mental health struggles. That was one of the coolest experiences I've had as a journalist, like watching. I think sometimes when any of us get to the point of publishing a story with like that kind of emotional depth, you sort of feel like you've touched all the material, you've kind of experienced it, not just yourself, but with Barbara and other people. And to hear like the voices of Ravi come to life in this story was just like one of the coolest things that, like, I've never had. I know people who have had, you know, works adapted into TV or, you know, film, and like I've never had that happen. So this is the kind of the closest I've seen. But this is like, they actually just like were reading the story, but putting the voices behind my actual words. So that was an incredible experience. I think more important than the like recognition it received was the fact that the impact that this story had in particular, which was it led to a lawyer choosing to represent Barbara because of reading the story and then filing a lawsuit on behalf of Ravi in last 2 months ago. And at which seems like that's the reason why we, you know, at ProPublica, one of the things we tend to do and have a lot of conversations about on the front end of a story is the question of why are we writing this? And as an organization that is focused on public interest and accountability, we try to design stories around having impact. You can't always predict, of course, the impact that you'll have in the world, but by having the conversation and at least considering what could happen, I think you increase the odds of things potentially coming out of a story. And even when you do that, it doesn't always happen. If more often than not doesn't, but this is an example where there was a clear, like, the lawyer told me if not for the story, he could not have like sold his partners on representing Barbara. And I think for Barbara, it is like a continuation of her work as an advocate to try to have some kind of accountability in the health insurance world that she was not able to benefit from.
And so is that ongoing, that legal process?
Yeah, that's ongoing and will be ongoing probably for years, I'm sure.
Yes. Hi, it's Jacob again. Did you know the Sunday Long Read has a members program? For $5 a month, or less if you join annually, you can get the weekly newsletter on Saturday evening before everyone else. With your membership, you'll also get special members-only editions of the newsletter on holidays. Plus, you'll be helping us support great journalism. You can become a member by visiting sundaylongread.com/membership. That's sundaylongread.com/membership. We'd be so grateful if you helped us. We now return to Georgia and some questions from the audience.
Max, thanks for coming. I'm Wes Purple, finishing up the program here. You said Ravi did everything right. And addicts, we're all flawed, but addicts tend to wear their flaws on the outside. So, you know, we talk about trying to find, you know, the person who's going to be the focus, like you said, of the camera on your shoulder. So could you talk about the process of trying to evaluate and how you ended up with Ravi and how many people did you talk to and just sort of the nuts and bolts of that process?
I probably spoke with, thanks for the question. I probably spoke with a couple dozen lawyers, experts, family members, and individuals who are experiencing their insurance challenges. And you know, this is a wide range, but since it's a story about mental health and insurance, like some of these were, you know, I remember talking with a dad whose child experiencing autism had, you know, was getting care denied. So it was some of that, some classic, just like solely mental health claims denied. And then some that were more a combination of addiction and mental health issues. I think that one of the challenges is like, how was the scope of the denial or the inability to get care? Because there was no actual health care. Like when Ravi got care, he got the care, but more often than not, he couldn't access the provider, which is different from like someone going to a hospital and then having the bill that was because the insurance company denied the claim for the care. Since the ghost network, I think that one of the things was like, as we were talking to people, different people were experiencing a set of different insurance problems. Some there might have been a claim denied and the ghost network issue was happening. In other cases, there might have been like 2 other different tactics that a company was using. I think the challenge was like, if people are in the story have different experiences, but have, maybe how do you sort of hone in on a single insurance practice? So part of that challenge was winnowing people, the potential people down from like, is this a story about all the insurance challenges, or how do we tell this story about primarily the ghost network thread alone? In order to accentuate and demonstrate like why this problem is particularly challenging for people with insurance. And then I think to your question of like, how do you choose the right person? Part of it comes back to this idea of like proximity being power, and also like, what is the harm? I was open to the right person who was still alive, but maybe had experienced some harm, being a potential alternate person or different person that I could have focused on. But I think because of the doors that were opened by Barbara, both with her outline as well as seeing the potential records, like if that was the scaffolding for a story, then all these other records can be the walls, can help fill in the different kind of like the openings that she may not have had access to, but like, or knew that she had access to, but we were able like together to get those records, or I could file open records requests to get additional things to help build upon that scaffolding.
I'm Emily Wood. You mentioned getting the vegetables into a story, and I was curious. So you're telling, a story about Ravi, but you're also trying to tell about this broader issue with ghost networks. So you have all this information about them and you've researched them. How do you actually get that into your writing without disrupting the narrative?
I had an editor once tell me that if someone's going to take the time to read a 30-minute story, it better be damn worth it. And I think it's the first 5 to 10 minutes of that are everything. And if you give someone a reason, like in the middle of drinking coffee and their kid suddenly needs them, or a phone call comes in, or there's some other distraction, like there's a chance of losing them early on. So in this kind of story, having narrative be a driver, a force that drives someone through the story to the point that they're so committed that they want to read to the end, is like the most challenging part of writing a story like this. To that end, I think we wanted to have, if the goal was to get people to care about Ravi by the end of the first section, and if you can care about him through this absurd call that's happening, that I think even if you haven't, I think most of us have probably had a Giovanni that we've spoken to in some way on a call, if not an insurance call, a customer service call of some kind. But we never hear those voices and the absurdity of what that experience can be like. And so I think with the tape, it was like once we had the recording of that call on the day that Ravi, like the stakes could not have been higher because Ravi was about to jump in front of a bus, and he was looking for, trying to grasp onto any sort of care. And then he gets faced with, all the weirdness of that call. I don't think people needed to know about Centene. They didn't need to know about Ghost, like kind of the lawsuits. Like all that stuff could come later once people cared about Ravi and once people could understand the stakes of what was happening. So I think that's how you get people to eat their vegetables in a story like that, by getting them to become invested in everything else first and in the primary, subjects of the story, which is, the hardest part to do.
Thank you, Max, for doing this story. This kind of reporting is so difficult and so valuable to people. I'm curious about the follow-up to the story. I got very you documented your many attempts to get the insurance company to tell you their side of the story, and it went nowhere. And I'm reading this, and I want to take something away from it for me and my family. How do I avoid getting into a health insurance situation like what happened to Ravi? Because it is clearly the ghost networks are a big problem, and I think everybody's had some experience with that.
It's a great question, and it's a question we thought about a lot as we were working on this story, because in addition to writing about the problems Ravi faced, we didn't want to leave our readers with no solutions or no way of getting to the end of this and feeling hopeless and without any way forward. When it started published, we had a sidebar run with it that was based on, to help me understand and shape the story. I had been chatting with maybe a dozen or so experts who some were insurance advocates, some were policymakers, some were they were primary care providers who have worked with insurance. And so all those conversations helped allow me to write with authority, but a lot of those conversations were also kind of the vegetables of the problems. And so one of the things we did was we asked all of them to help us create, share what their guide would be for individuals. If you run into a ghost network issue, what is at what point everyone agrees that you shouldn't have to make 24 calls to get the kind of care that you need. But when do you actually call the insurance company, try to escalate it and file a grievance? So the experts sort of helped us come up with a guide that published with this story. And that guide is something that's online, and no one really created that kind of guide before. So I think doesn't answer all the questions, but it is at least a starting point in the where most people don't have a sense of where to go. So I can, if you go back to the story online, you'll see it embedded in that story. It's in one of the first embeds of that story. But then that probably lays out the advice better than I could do right now.
I'm Gerald Witt, first year here in the program. Thanks for your work on this. It's really important to highlight what addicts see that the rest of the world doesn't see. My question is more kind of a back house, making the sausage kind of thing for people who may not be journalists in the room. You talk about the weekend spent getting that 5 hours of the calls that he had been on hold for. It's not all just good luck, and a little bit of it is just following your nose. From the phone records, the volume that you had, how much time did you spend following something that ended up being kind of a cold lead, or didn't just, you don't magically arrive at that 5 hours? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think of your Verizon or T-Mobile phone record and trying and seeing none. I'm probably at this point only know 10 numbers by heart, but imagine looking at your call log and trying to reverse engineer who you called before. You might have some good guesses, but you'd also have to a lot of it's just plugging people into Google and trying to, or into Nexus or some other public record site that might give you a sense of who someone is. I also did some of that by talking with Barbara, just hey, can you plug this in your phone and tell me who this number is? And she'd be oh, it's my friend or my sister. And so kind of create like a lot of, most of the calls were not relevant to the story. Let's say there was 500 calls over 6 months for Ravi alone. Some of it was him just, I would later learn it was just about like talking about football on a New Year's Day or something like that. And it was not really relevant. But imagine you're a sculptor with a big like piece of granite, and you are, and this is true of like finding the good material in a log, as well as writing a whole story out of this sort of material. But like you have far more information that could be actually used in the story, and your job, and when you have an abundance of material, is to sort of chisel away and try to like make something out of that. And so the call log, every call that I found that was just to like, he was making reservations at like the tavern down the street or seeing if they were open. That wasn't wasted, because I can see, it helped me understand like how his day was working. It helped me understand the rhythms that he was moving through on good days and bad. And it helped me realize like on the days where, one of the things I was able to tell is like he would have really good days when he would make a lot of calls, and then really bad days where he wouldn't at all. And some of that was just like, I wouldn't know if I didn't try to unearth all the numbers. I wouldn't know not which ones were the good ones, but also I would lose insight around like just how he was moving through the world during that period, which kind of, even if it's not written in a single word, helped shape my understanding of who he was and kind of helped me make better reporting decisions towards talking with certain friends about certain things that helped get me an additional piece of information that was relevant to the story. But yeah, there's a lot of relevant things that can be left on the table, and there's also things that like are dead ends that you hit. That happens with every story, but it's a numbers game.
Hey, I'm CD, Dave Hires. My question is about whether you remember, because we had the rest of our craft talks today, whether you remember what your craft talk was when you were here. Yeah. And how you've continued to use that in your work. Yeah.
I did a craft talk with my dear friend Katoya, Katie Fleming, and we did. It was about, I forget which one I did. I think it was about writing about trauma and writing through trauma, and it was I think mine was the writing about, and it was a combination of I had spoken with a number of journalists who cover trauma in their daily work, and talked to them about their experiences and like what students could learn from them, from their own successes and failures. And then I recall a tip sheet being handed out that had some of that. That's probably on my computer somewhere. And then I was also talking about like what I had learned about writing about trauma in the set of stories that it was ultimately in my portfolio, which was not just the memoir piece that I mentioned, but also the story that I wrote for Sunday Long Read, which was about this tumultuous relationship between a father/songwriter and then his daughter, who's now a songwriter, and some other stories in there as well. So that was what I focused on.
Thank you for being here. I'm Brooke Heberling. I'm a first year. I have personal connection to this piece because I was kicked out of a treatment center before I was ready. And I was wondering, the story that interests me with you is your connection with your own mother. And I wanted to know how this piece helped you understand her struggle a little bit better, and maybe did it heal something with your understanding of her past?
Yeah, I think not exclusively with this story, but kind of all the stories that I've written about, like why people facing addiction don't get access to the care they need, as well as how addiction care is sort of it's treated differently than cancer or other kinds of care, that we all have a certain understanding of what is acceptable, what's not. I think every time I'm reporting about why someone doesn't get addiction care, it inevitably helps me better understand what my mom experienced in terms of, the kinds of care that she was trying to get, the number of times she tried to get sober, but then relapsed over the years, the lack of evidence around something like AA, not to say it doesn't work for some people, but the combination of things that were true to her experience are things I'm thinking about when other people aren't getting care too, and that it's, I think, and you often hear about the idea of like personal responsibility within addiction care, and the more I've reported on the systems that make it like difficult for people to get care, it kind of shapes my thinking around like what is truly is that true, and like would we be having those same kinds of conversations around, like we don't have those kinds of conversations around like the way someone eats and the kind of cancer or diabetes that they have necessarily, or at least to the extent that what we might have around drinking and addiction.
I'm Jen Winburn. I'm a mentor in this program. I wanted to go back to sort of this issue of the combination of investigative reporting with storytelling. And I found it really remarkable that you were able to withhold that sort of big nut-graphy section where you help us zoom out and understand the importance of what Ravi's going through, how it's systemic, all of that. But I also really was interested in the choice in the ending. The ending was beautiful, and the lifeless foot. I wanted that story to end there. When I read the note that you had about putting the story together in the sources, it then made me sort of wonder if, so you referenced there the autopsy report, which Barbara did not see but had her sister summarize, and which you reviewed. And you say Ravi's death was ruled an accident, likely due to complications from excessive drinking. Now, from the scene, we know there's four empty vodka bottles in the room, and the Murphy bed is folded up. So I guess my question was, did you and your editors have conversations about whether the cause of death belonged in the narrative, and whether, had the autopsy just said it was an accident, whether there would have been a conversation there about whether that was enough for this story? Because of course the story is showing you that the lack of care is going to lead to his death. So I'm just wondering if that autopsy had said ruled an accident, whether there would have been any other issues discussed about how to use that.
That's certainly something we had conversations around, like whether that should be in the build up to somewhat like part of the where do we end conversation. Like is that in the draft or not? I spent a lot, talking about cold leads. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how, like, the mechanics of what happened. And it is something that I think, that is why I stayed in the one floor below in the same kind of Airbnb, like an Airbnb that was identical to his apartment, trying to understand, like, how does this happen? As part of the police photos, I was able to see that there was the 4 bottles. I felt we owed the reader at least the acknowledgement of what we know about the death afterwards. I don't have a good answer to your question, in part because I think the difference between accident, likely due to excessive drinking, or just like an accident, i.e. like an accidental overdose, I think you end up in the same place. short of having some sort of better like record of what actually happened. No one was in the room with him that day except for his dog. And I think it comes back to this idea of just, if it was just an accident, like, I don't think it would have changed the thrust of the story. So, yeah.
I'm Amanda Green. I have a question about the Jason Molina story. Was that something that was assigned to you, or did you pitch, or whatever? It's kind of a three-part question. Were you a fan of his? Are you? Did it change how you appreciate or whatever with his music? Seeing, because I know of the darkness in his story.
Yeah, my first job in journalism, I was an editor, a multimedia editor at a magazine called Paste, which was a music magazine. I was mostly there as a AV producer. Like I produced the equivalent of Tiny Desk concerts and edited photos for them, and then was learning to write, starting the journey of writing through those skills. As someone at a music magazine, I had come to know his music while being there. And if I recall correctly, he had a tour that was canceled, and for some, it was a tour with a record with another artist named Will Johnson that got canceled abruptly. And I had heard somewhere that was related to drinking, which he had struggled with over the years. And so I wrote to him during this period where, in the years where he kind of was alive but not healthy, and just to see if he might be open to talking with me. And he wasn't ready, but he wrote back to me, and then he passed, and then I felt that story was going to be, it was an important, worthwhile story to sort of report out what happened. And so, yeah, I mean, and then I spent, to answer your other question about, it was a long journey towards pitching it, having to pull it from publications because of different circumstances. It wasn't the right fit. Then it ultimately published in the Chicago Reader with an editor named Mara Shalhoub, who's now 11 years later my editor today at ProPublica. So it's the first time I worked with an editor, and kept trying to find ways to go back and work with her.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I'm a first year, not a journalist by training, but so the question I want is, how did you get those recordings? Like when Centene is like not talking to you now, how did you get them?
So any of us can get our calls from an insurance company. There's a law called HIPAA, which is an acronym that is governs all the patient privacy laws, or like what hospitals can or can't say when one gets care. But deep in HIPAA, you have the ability as an individual to request your own records or your children's records, or if you have power of attorney over someone, their records too. I'd known about the health record side of it for years, but when I was chatting with a lawyer, one of the experts in this reporting, he had mentioned you can also get the insurance calls too, which I had known you can get for claim denials, but for calls where no care happened, I was not aware of that. And so with Barbara's help, I worked with her to draft a request to send to the insurance company. And then, a month, the law specifically says they have to give it to you within 30 days. And on the 30th day, they called, said that, and then they were trying to get these old files off a PC, and there were some technical issues of actually getting the records, but then they finally came through that way. So thanks to a almost 30-year-old law and some lawyers who helped me understand where I could find it, that's how we got that.
Well, Max and Jacob, thank you so much for being with us today. Max, you wrote a terrific story, and this conversation certainly enlightened us on the process and all the work that you have to do to put together a story like this. So we are grateful to you both being here today. Let's give them all a hand.
That's it for this live edition of the Sunday Long Read. This episode was hosted by me, Jacob Feldman, and produced by Matthew Whitehurst. The executive producer of the Sunday Long Read podcast is Étienne Lajoie. The Sunday Long Read podcast is an extension of the Sunday Long Read newsletter, which is edited by me and Don Van Natta Jr. If you are a professor and you are listening thinking, I wish the SLR podcast was in my classroom, send us an email at editors, that's editors, EDITORS, at sundaylongread.com. Otherwise, Amanda will be back soon with our next Behind the Story show. Thanks for listening, and thanks for reading.